Opname nummer 13.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our third and final panel for Emancipation Day Matters, Materiality and Cultural Contestation in the Dutch, Spanish, and French Caribbean. Our series really explores the complex histories and the contest and the contested state of emancipation in contemporary Caribbean society. Our moderator for today will be Raymond Laureano Ortez. And first, I want to just talk about the song that was playing. It's called Dicky Manero, and it's from the UNESCO Memory of the World Register for Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's located in the Zikinza collection that's housed in the National Archives of Curacao. And it's a series of 1,400 songs and short stories collected in the 1950s. And this specific song was sung by the enslaved in the Dutch Caribbean, and it was performed and recorded. So I'm going to take the time to introduce our moderator. I'll also ask my co-panelists. They can go ahead and turn on their videos. So Dr. Raymond Loreno Ortiz is an engineer, management consultant, and a historian with a PhD in Puerto Rico and Caribbean history. His dissertation explored Puerto Rico's international relations between the 1980s and 90s and received an honorable mention for the Caribbean Studies of Association Best Dissertation Award in 2018. He is currently a researcher in the Joseph Corbell School of International Studies at the University of Denver and the Greater Caribbean Work Group in the CLACSO, Latin American Council of Social Sciences, and he's a faculty member at the Center for Advanced Studies on Puerto Rico and the Caribbean. And he's currently chair and president of the UK Society of Caribbean Studies, vice president of the Association of Caribbean Historians, and executive council member for the Caribbean Studies Association. So I just want to welcome Raymond today, and he'll take it from here. If you have any questions, please feel free to put it in our chat on Facebook, and we look forward to engaging you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shawnee, for this opportunity to have this pan-regional conversation on Emancipation Day. This conversation on how emancipation or slavery abolition is celebrated, is commemorated around the Caribbean. As you mentioned, this is the third panel of this series, and the previous panels we were able to listen to get to know about how these Emancipation Day celebrations are held in the Anglophone Caribbean, Trinidad and Tobago, Jamaica, St. Lucia, Barbados. Now we have the opportunity to do the same, but in the rest of the Caribbean, French, Dutch, Spanish Caribbean. So thank you again for this opportunity. We are going to be starting, and again, we are going to try to add to the discussion and conversation that is trying to create an awareness that Emancipation Day is not only a celebration of a single day, an event that happened only in a single day, but it is a celebration, a commemoration of a process that started back then, and it is still ongoing. We are going to be starting with our first panelist, Professor Dr. Rosemary Allen. She studied anthropology at the University of Nijmegen and obtained her doctorate degree at the University of Utrecht in the Netherlands. She has been conducting oral history interviews on the islands of the Dutch Caribbean. She has co-published, edited, and published several books and articles on the cultural and social history of Curaçao, with special attention on cultural traditions, migration, gender studies, and cultural diversity. In 2018 or 2015, she was awarded the Cola de Bro Prize, Curaçao's most prestigious national award in the area of culture, art, and science. At the moment, she's setting up a program of cultural studies at the University of Curaçao. She's also the local coordinator for the project Cultural Practices of Citizenship under Conditions of Fragmented Sovereignty, Gendered and Sexual Citizenship in Curaçao and Bonaire of the University of Curaçao and the University of Amsterdam. In 2021, she was appointed extraordinary professor in the field of culture, community, and history at the University of Curaçao, Dr. Moises da Costa Gomez. With you, Rosemary Allen. Thank you for joining us.
Okay, thank you very much, Raymond. And I will also like to thank the University Museum, University of the West Indies Museum, for having me to give the presentation, which I think is very worthwhile if we want to start the communication or continue with the communication between the Caribbean islands and societies. My presentation is titled Multifocality on Freedom and Emancipation in the Dutch Caribbean. And slide number 2, please. Yes. What I will be doing in my presentation, I will be looking at emancipation as part of a process that already started during slavery and which the enslaved also participated. I would like to answer 2 questions, which are, how did enslaved people oppose slavery in the Dutch colonies and continue to free them from slavery? And another question I would like to answer is, how did the idea of freedom interconnect with celebration of emancipation in the course of time? And afterwards, I will give some reflection. In my presentation, I draw on oral history to highlight the voices considered to be from below. My focus will be on the Dutch Caribbean island, where I've done most of my oral history fieldwork, but I will also pay some attention to Suriname. Slavery was abolished in the Dutch Caribbean colonies on July 1st, 1863. And that was much later than in the British and French Caribbean colonies, where abolition occurred in 1834 and 1848, respectively. Slide number 3, which is the one we are seeing now, given geographical orientation. In 1863, the Dutch Empire comprised of 6 Caribbean islands, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curaçao, also called the Dutch Leeward Islands, and Saba, Statia, and Sint Maarten, which are more in the north, also being called the Dutch Windward Island. The other Dutch Caribbean colony at that time was Suriname. These territories has been conquered and occupied by the Netherlands between 1631 and 1667. Their different natural environment influenced the manner of colonization and enslavement in these societies, and it also determined their importance to the colonizer. During the first phase of the transatlantic slave trade, Curaçao and also St. Eustatius functioned as major port for the transshipment of enslaved Africans brought to the Americas on Dutch ships on the surrounding island and to the mainland. After 1713, the Dutch slave trade declined because of British competition, and the Dutch West Indian Company's monopoly was abolished in 1737, allowing other entities and individuals to trade in enslaved persons. The Dutch Caribbean did not know large plantation economies except for Suriname, where sugar and coffee were produced in large quantities as commodities for export to Europe. On the island, plantations were mostly small in size compared to those in the rest of the Caribbean, had small concentration of enslaved persons, and did not produce a monocrop for export. Next slide, please. The enslaved people in the Dutch Caribbean resisted slavery and sought freedom from the beginning. We can point to Marronage in Suriname, whereby between the mid-70s and the late 18th century, enslaved Africans fled from the coast to the interior of Suriname, and from there waged brutal guerrilla warfare against the Dutch for half a century. Their autonomy and separate territory were recognized through a peace treaty with the Dutch in the 1760s. On the island, enslaved would run away from the plantation and would also cross imperial boundaries, escaping to territories under a different colonial regime. In these territories, the law was sometimes more accommodated towards them as human beings, but they could also have the misfortune of becoming enslaved again or being sent back. Enslaved from Curacao and Aruba usually fled to Venezuela, and it was known that in 1760s there was a community in Coro, Venezuela, consisting of about 400 enslaved, mostly African-born, who had fled from Curacao. Enslaved from the Dutch Windward Island would escape to the British island in the vicinity. An example of this search for freedom that has become part of the collective memory is the story of the young enslaved woman named Locke in St. Martin. She was considered rebellious as she repeatedly tried to escape. During one of her attempts to escape, she was caught and returned to her owner plantation, where one of her breasts was cut off as a form of punishment and as a sign of warning to all other enslaved. People called her hence Wantiti Loke for a long time, but this name was later dropped because of its association with the punishment imposed upon her. She is considered now an icon of the emancipation process in St. Martin, and in 2006, a monument was erected in her honor on the island. Slide number 6, please. Opposition to slavery and the urge for freedom was also clearly expressed through slave revolts. In Curacao, the slave revolt in 1795 was the largest and most significant in terms of the number of enslaved who participated, the number of days that the revolt lasted, and its consequences, such as the new laws regulating the quantity of food and clothing that enslaved should receive from their master. The 1795 revolt was spearheaded by Tula, Bashankamparta, and others. The subsequent trial of Tula is well documented and provides insight into his vision of freedom. In dialogue with the Roman Catholic priest Giusti, who mediated between the revolting enslaved and the colonial authorities, Tula pointed to freedom and equality as the prime motivation for his action. His famous statement was, "Father, we don't want to harm anybody. We just want our freedom. You yourself have taught us that everyone comes from the same father and mother. Then how come some people are masters and some are enslaved?" And this statement is considered an important legacy in the emancipation process of the Curaçaoan population. Slide number 6, please. As we have seen, enslaved people pursued freedom in several ways, and the desire to be free became stronger, especially on the Dutch Windward Island, when the enslaved in the neighborhood British and French colonies obtained their freedom. Cases of running away increased when slavery was abolished in the British territories in 1834. In St. Martin, the Dutch territory that shared an island with French St. Martin, abolition in the French colonies in 1848 triggered strikes by enslaved, claims of freedom, and a large number of escape from the Dutch to the French side of the island. This forced the Dutch to promulgate measures through which the enslaved of St. Martin became treated essentially as free workers with employment contracts. By law, they were still enslaved, yet they were paid paid a salary. In the Dutch Caribbean, there was no anti-slavery movement as there was in the English-speaking Caribbean, and to some extent in the French-speaking Caribbean. There was also less debate on the island than in Suriname, where the sugar planter lobbied the government in a fervent manner. Most of the discussion on the island focused on financial matters, particularly the amount of compensation that slave owners would receive from the government once freedom was granted to the enslaved. Additionally, concern focused on the social conduct of the soon-to-be freed enslaved. There was some doubt as to whether the enslaved were ready for freedom, or more specifically, whether they could be able to deal with their newly acquired freedom. In Curacao, written documents show that the enslaved anticipated the end of slavery well before 1863 and gradually became more and more anxious about the prospect. I've also been able to collect some songs that show the discontent with waiting. One song is particularly interesting as the name of Queen Victoria appears in it. Mentioning Queen Victoria in a Curaçaoan song is another indication that enslaved communicated with each other across imperial boundaries. In Curaçao, they were thus aware that the enslaved in the British colony had gained freedom under the reign of Queen Victoria. In the following song lyrics, freedom is referred to in the form of a demand. The song is in Papiamento, a Creole language that is the first language of the majority of Curaçao. And it says like this: Libertad Galité, la reina Victoria mande cospanos. Libertad Galité, la reina Victoria mande cospanos. Libertad Galité, Willem III, which was the king of the Netherlands at that time, manda e cospanos. Freedom, equality, Queen Victoria said the thing to us. Freedom, equalities, Queen Victoria sent the thing to us. Freedom, equality, William III sent the thing to us. And interesting also, a variant of this song was also documented in Aruba, which had less number of enslaved. Okay, thank you very much for slide number 7. On the day that slavery was abolished, the Emancipation Proclamation was read. In Curaçao, the center of the Dutch colonial rule for the island, that was done in Papiamento, Dutch, and English. In all the Dutch colonies, people celebrated the day joyfully, mostly in their own way, sometimes opposing what the establishment deemed proper. I have only 5 minutes left. This song is one of the songs which was sung during the 1st of July, and whereby the enslaved people expressed that, they were joyful and happy that they got their freedom and that their master won't put iron bar on them anymore. Let's continue on Contestation. The next slide, please. Yes. There were also songs. The euphoria about freedom was also expressed in song. And this is an example of one of the songs which was expressed. Happy, happy July Day. Glad to see another day. Happy, happy July Day. I don't care them what the people say. Happy, happy July Day. Let's go to slide number 9. Let's give an indication about the number of enslaved by which the owner received compensation. And it's you see that in Suriname, the amount of enslaved people were much larger than the rest, while in Curaçao also the amount was larger compared to the other. But it gives an indication of how many enslaved people there were, and then the number of enslaved by which the owner received their compensation. Slide, yes. This gives an overview of the first official celebration in 1888 that was in Curaçao, whereby you see the more official, the more being celebrated in official places. while at the other part, you will see that the people also celebrated their the abolition of enslavement in their own way, with using typical African and traditional instruments and to express their joy for the freedom. Interesting, the next slide is to be shown is that in Curacao, the slave revolt of 1795 has in the course of time become celebrated as the primary symbol of real emancipation, as opposed to the formal emancipation obtained in 1863. And you see that since the Second World War, progressive voices have suggested that this revolt against the dehumanizing situation of slavery as should receive more attention and should be seen as a model of the nation's search for collective freedom and justice. And in the course of time, you see that this celebration every year is celebrated on the 17th of August. And it has been named also the Day of Liberty. Slide number 12. Since the constitutional reform of October 10, in which the island of Bonaire, for example, became an overseas municipality of the Netherlands, the Bonairean population has become more interested in its own culture and history. And you see that the celebration, this is a celebration in St. Martin, whereby people are performing the Ponam dance, which was a dance, which the dance during slavery, and which has become the national dance. The other slide is referring to Suriname, also where the 1st of July is being celebrated in in an extensive way. And interesting also is that Suriname brought this celebration also to Curacao when they migrated in the 20th century, but also when they went to the Netherlands, they also brought this celebration to the Netherlands. And through their effort, it has made also that the people in the Netherlands have become more aware of the slavery and emancipation. Okay, I will finalize now with some reflection. In my presentation, I've addressed the multiplicality of freedom and emancipation as manifested in the Dutch Caribbean across time. This society, some more than others, have struggled to make slavery, freedom, and emancipation topics avoided for a long time, part of the national conversation. At present, there seems to be an awakening in the Netherlands, fostered in a large part by the Surinamese diaspora of African descent, through which the Dutch participation in the enslavement of Africans has become a topic of mainstream debates and studies. In the Dutch Caribbean too, the history and legacy of slavery are receiving greater attention through sessions of national dialogue. And this awakening includes claim of reparation. For the islands, unlike Suriname, which unlike Suriname, are still part of the Dutch kingdom, this reawakening coincides with renewed discussion about the relationship with the Netherlands and the question of whether real emancipation can be achieved within the existing relationship or not. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rosemary, for those insights about the Dutch Caribbean, Emancipation Day in the Dutch Caribbean. Now we are going to introduce you to Dr. Juan Giusti Cordero. He will be talking about Emancipation Day celebrations in the Spanish Caribbean, specifically in Puerto Rico. He is a retired professor of history at the University of Puerto Rico, Rio Piedras, the main campus of the public university in Puerto Rico. He holds a PhD in sociology from SUNY Binghamton and a law degree from the University of Puerto Rico. Dr. Giusti Cordero research areas are the social, environmental history of the Caribbean, sugar plantation production, race and class, and Afro-Puerto Rican cultural history. Dr. Giusti Cordero is co-editor of Sugarlandia Revisited, Sugar and Colonialism in Asia and the Americas, 1800 through 1940, which was published in 2007. An introduction of the social sciences textbook published in 2016, and also co-editor of the book Race and Rurality in the Global Economy, published in 2018 by SUNY Press. He's currently working on a book on the history of Puerto Rico's Loíza region from the 18th century through the 20th century. And probably many know that Loíza is a municipality in Puerto Rico that is very proud of its African heritage. Dr. Giusti Cordero directed the University of Puerto Rico's Urban Action Center and the Caribbean Social Science Archive, where the Sidney Mintz Gordon Lewis collections are held at the Institute of Caribbean Studies at the University of Puerto Rico. Dr. Giusti Cordero has advised community groups in Piñones, Loíza, and Vieques on the impact of resort development and military installations. With you, Dr. Juan Giusti. Juan, your microphone needs to be activated.
No. Good afternoon. Many thanks to Dr. Shawnee Roper of the University of West Indies Museum, her staff at the museum, and collaborating entities for the invitation to participate in this distinguished panel. In Puerto Rico, we have great admiration for UWI and many, though not enough, connections with UWI. So it is a special pleasure to be, at least online and from across our Caribbean ocean, at your home. In my talk, I will first talk about the Hispanophone Caribbean in regional context and the diverging trajectories of emancipation, even within the Hispanophone subregion, and the discourse of Puerto Rican Creole, mostly white abolitionists. Secondly, and grounded in that history, I will address the topic of slave compensation, quote and unquote, that is slaveholder compensation at the time of emancipation. This process occurred in Puerto Rico, and as you well know, in the English colonies, as well as in the Dutch colonies, as Professor Allen has just discussed, and in the French colonies, but in terms of the Spanish colonies in Puerto Rico, but not in Cuba, and certainly not in the Dominican Republic. It is a dimension of emancipation that only recently has become a part of the public conversation on the matter, especially in the context of debates on reparations and foregrounds and neglected angle of abolitionist discourse. Finally, I will close with some images of monuments in Puerto Rico concerning abolition, emancipation, and colonialism as part of the active construction and reconstruction of memory we are all engaged in. I also have some comments on the meanings of abolition and emancipation, which differ in the Hispanophone and Anglophone Caribbean, both in the history and the historiography, and which we might get to in the questions and answers. I should note that by Hispanic Caribbean, I signify the insular Caribbean, that is Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Puerto Rico, with particular emphasis on Puerto Rico. A broader discussion could well be made regarding the Hispanic Caribbean regions of Venezuela, Colombia, and Central America. Emancipation came first in 1820 in Santo Domingo, 1822, I'm sorry, as a result of the Haitian occupation, reunification of the eastern two-thirds of Hispaniola, Santo Domingo, but things get complicated after that, so we will see, as we will see later. In Puerto Rico, emancipation was legislated in 1873 by Spain with a 3-year apprenticeship period. And in Cuba, emancipation came last and was largely a result of the 10 Years' War from 1868 to 78 and formally in 1880. The regional context. Slavery in the Hispanophone Caribbean has a specific history that is often missed in the rather Anglo-centric, plantation-centered approaches of much Caribbean historiography. This is essential for understanding Spanish Caribbean societies at the time of emancipation, whatever their differences, and they were many. Cuba, Santo Domingo, and Puerto Rico were not dominated by plantation slavery in the sense that Barbados and Martinique were since the 17th century, or that Jamaica and Saint Domingue were since the 18th century. Instead, the large, thinly populated territories of the Spanish islands became havens for buccaneers and other runaways and hinterlands of sorts for the sugar islands themselves, producing timber and foodstuffs for the depleted territories of the sugar islands, most obviously in the relation between East and West Hispaniola. This made for a large population of de facto smallholders who were for the most part colored. In the case of Cuba and Puerto Rico, when large-scale plantation production finally developed, Cuba in the late 18th century, Puerto Rico in the 19th, it did so in a historical space that was already busy with other social relations and racial crossings, and where the slave population always remained smaller or even far smaller percentage-wise than in the French and English islands. Puerto Rico, notably, had the largest free-colored population of any Caribbean society, and in the mid-19th century had more free-colors than Cuba had slaves. Moreover, unlike the Anglophone and Francophone Caribbean, slavery in Cuba and Puerto Rico developed after the Haitian Revolution, when slavery was in the defensive. Planters lived in fear of another such revolution, and the slave trade, now abolished by the British, was under pressure throughout the Atlantic. Slavery was also ended or undermined in former Spanish colonies in the continent during the Wars of Independence, followed soon after by slave emancipation in the British and French colonies. However, the Spanish Antilles and especially Cuba offered huge expanses of fresh new lands for sugarcane and all sorts of plantation inputs, while sugar prices remained attractive given the absence of the world's main sugar producer, Saint-Domingue, in the context of a booming Atlantic economy. Living in the era of the second slavery, as Dale Talmadge has called it, could drive a planter crazy. Such riches within reach, so many perils. In this sense, the Hispanic Caribbean was closer to Guyana and to Trinidad, formerly a Spanish island, not coincidentally. So much for similarities between the Spanish colonies. The differences between them were at least as great. Cuba and Puerto Rico developed plantation economies, while Santo Domingo, after thriving as a hinterland of the wealthiest and most brutal colony in the world, Saint-Domingue, was swept up by the Haitian Revolution. To note some demographic differences between Puerto Rico, just slightly larger than Jamaica, and Cuba, which is over 12 times Puerto Rico. If you would show slide 1, actually, yeah, with the statistics. We can see the big differences between Cuba and Puerto Rico. Close to the time of abolition, emancipation in Puerto Rico in 1873, the statistics that we have are for 1861, 1867. There were 1.36 million total population in Cuba, of which 27% were enslaved, and 233,000 free colors, 17%. The population of enslaved had dropped from 1840, but still was substantial, was 27%. In Puerto Rico, 1867, total population 656,000, and only 6.6% slaves, and 41% free colored. Far more than Cuba and more than the slave population of Cuba. So this is a major consideration to take into account in terms of emancipation in Puerto Rico. The slave population was very small, especially by that time. It had been greater in the 1830s. It had reached about 15% of the Puerto Rican population in the 1830s, but was now only about 5-6%, 32,000 enslaved. And only about half of them worked on the fields. The rest were urban slaves. The first crack in the Spanish government's opposition to abolition was the creation of a special commission with elected Puerto Rican and Cuban members, the Junta Informativa, or Informative Commission. This commission accomplished little in Madrid, but 3 of the 4 Puerto Rican members were earnest, even radical reformers, and their separate report is a venerable historical document in Puerto Rico. The claim to hegemony and modernity of the Creole landowning and professional class in Puerto Rico, mostly white, and their claims to a kind of Puerto Rico, to Puerto Rico as a kind of racial democracy, is quite rooted in this conjuncture. In Madrid, after 1866, emancipation was initially considered as a joint issue for Cuba and Puerto Rico, but it soon became evident that unless separated from Cuba, as seemed reasonable to do, given their differences, abolition would be impossible in Puerto Rico, even with compensation, as indemnifying the 200,000 enslaved in Cuba in contrast to Puerto Rico's 32,000, was soon ruled out of the question in the Spanish Parliament. As in Brazil and the US, emancipation in Cuba took the radical route of being without compensation. Right, and the slave population in Cuba had dropped by the 1870s, had dropped to 200,000. And that was the number that was being considered for compensation, and it was ruled to be unrealistic. And supposedly thank you, Shawnee. This is the kind of a bonus ticket for compensation or indemnización, as it was called in Spanish, that was issued to pay for the slave compensation, which is a funny term because it implies that the slaves were compensated, but it should be called slaveholder compensation, which it never was. It was never called that way. The Puerto Rican reformers' call to arms was in the name and honor, I quote, of our country, the immediate, radical, and definitive abolition of slavery. And by our country, they did not mean Spain, which outraged conservatives in the Spanish Cortes and in the island, who always suspected abolitionism to be a cover for separatism. The other slogan of the reformers cut closer to the bone: abolición inmediata, con o sin indemnización, immediate abolition with or without indemnization or compensation. For the question of compensation divided the Puerto Rican abolitionists quite deeply and remains a thorny issue, I would contend, to this day. As it happened, abolition without compensation was never considered seriously in the Spanish Cortes. Either compensation will be with abolition will be with compensation, or it would not happen. However, there were some abolitionists who were earnest in believing that abolition could and should be without compensation. That discussion has not really surfaced much in the historiography. Indeed, most of the 1873 abolition law, 4 of its 7 articles, were on the matter of indemnización, while the 2 provisions on the freed and slave were brief and, conveniently for the slaveholders, quite general. So in fact, if you look at it, the abolition law was essentially a compensation law. And most of it had to deal with slaveholder compensation. And that's not really considered in our views of abolition in Puerto Rico, and really should be. This perspective runs counter to the narrative where the mostly white Puerto Rican reformers were radical altruists, hell-bent on gaining a liberal progressive patria. The fact was that slavery was declining in Puerto Rico for multiple reasons, such as lower world sugar prices and oversupply due to technologically advanced sugar beet production, high Cuba-level slave prices that Puerto Rican planters could not afford, the availability of wage smallholders, and a growing coffee industry based on wage and tenant labor in Puerto Rico. In Cuba, however, slavery was still robust, as the 10 Years' War only affected the eastern part of the island, and the driving force behind the dismantling of plantation slavery was anti-colonial insurgency. The enslaved who joined the Cuban rebel forces were freed, and soon many others claimed their freedom as well. When the Cuban Emancipation Law finally came to be in 1880, it was almost a formality, and its apprenticeship period was ended in advance, as in the English colonies. So, on compensation and indemnization, we should say the following. In Puerto Rico, the enactment of the abolition law in 1873 is commemorated in a public holiday, March 22, since the 1950s. In fact, we are approaching the 150th anniversary commemoration next month, with a number of events to be held. In Cuba, however, the 1880 or 1888 dates are secondary in comparison with the start of the 10 Years' War, the Grito de Yara in 1868. It should also be noted, however, that abolition was a thorny issue among the pro-independence Cuban planters, as Raúl Cepero Bonilla has documented, and it was the enslaved themselves who drove the process forward. In times of the Cuban Revolution, Cuba celebrates by joining a much broader celebration, the Día Internacional de Recuerdo de las Víctimas de la Esclavitud y la Trata Transatlántica de Esclavos, which is celebrated in Cuba, International Day of Remembrance of the Victims of Slavery and the Transatlantic Slave Trade. In the Dominican Republic, abolition was also brought by force of arms in 1822, though, according to most Dominican historians, by a Haitian invading force as a blow to Creole landowners who opposed the invasion, or, according to most Haitian historians, as unification of Hispaniola and the elimination of a real reinvasion threat by France using Santo Domingo as a platform, as well, evidently, as abolishing the hated form of slavery. Abolition of slavery and its commemoration remains a controversial topic in the Dominican Republic. I found one commemoration there in 2019 by a political party, Movimiento Rebelde, with an emphasis on the role of slave resistance. An attempt to celebrate the El Día Internacional para la Abolición de la Esclavitud, International Day for the Abolition of Slavery, in 2019 was denied a permit at a public monument area for dubious reasons. And the Dominican Republic remains the only Latin American country that does not have an instituted date for the commemoration of slave emancipation. The matter of emancipation in the Republic is connected to the commemoration of independence, since Santo Domingo's Independence Day celebrates independence from Haiti in 1844, not independence from Spain, from which it twice broke free in 1921 and 1865. In Puerto Rico, the abolitionist discourse includes the notion that slavery was not as harsh as in other societies. In the 19th century, the comparison was made with Cuba and its very large-scale, very strong slave regime. In the 20th century, the comparison was made with the pre-Civil War US, and it remains a standard part of anti-colonialist discourse and use of the United States history. This has been a major point in the pro-autonomy, anti-statehood tradition in Puerto Rico, as was the notion that abolition was achieved in Puerto Rico without terrible bloodshed, unlike the US. Other elements of the abolitionist discourse were that slavery was holding Puerto Rico back economically, while emancipation was to bring greater economic development, and that abolition was essential to developing a liberal and progressive society. Abolition itself is depicted as an occasion for much celebration by one and all, and after abolition is contended, most of the former enslaved remain working with the slaveholders, often as part of the quote-unquote family, no irony intended. For reasons that need further exploration, abolition remained a popular celebration on and off in subsequent years until made an official holiday in the 1950s. From the perspective of Black popular culture, things may have looked differently, as Pete El Conde's song Abolición bears out, and I urge you to look it up in YouTube. It's a fantastic song and has a great refrain saying something like, La abolición llegó, pero para los negros no. Abolition came, but not for the Blacks, and the rest of the lyrics are very, very meaningful. Not welcome in white Creole discourse were the notions of anti-slavery resistance and African cultural specificity. Also not welcome is much emphasis on the fact that Puerto Rican slaveholders were all compensated, while the Cubans, as noted, were not. Puerto Rico slaveholders received an indemnization of 35 million pesetas for 32,000 enslaved, at a rough equivalence of 30 pesetas per British pound, using the earliest available figures for 1900. This equaled a global sum of 1.7 million pounds, and per enslaved person of all ages, 37 pounds. This indemnización was paid through a loan by the Spanish government, but guaranteed by revenues not of Madrid, but of the colonial treasury of Puerto Rico, which would have to assign 3.5 million pesetas annually. Regarding Britain, research at the Center for the Study of the Legacies of British Slavery has revealed that some 46,000 Britons received compensation under the Slave Compensation Act of 1837, which paid a total of 40 million pounds, a sum that equaled the 40% of the government's total annual expenditure in 1833. This 40 million sum is equivalent today to about 17 billion pounds, the largest payout until the bailout of the banks in 2008. The amount of compensation paid in Puerto Rico, 1.7 million British pounds, pales in comparison vis-a-vis the 40 million pounds paid by London. But when calculated as an average in relation to the numbers of enslaved persons of all ages, the payment in Puerto Rico, 37 pounds per person, was not qualitatively distant from the 53 pounds paid in the British colonies per enslaved person, assuming a global figure of 750,000 enslaved persons. These all being very much approximate numbers. It is the process and the debates around it that offer the closest comparison between Puerto Rico and the British colonies, and which, upon further research, would likely prove most enlightening. So I will finish up, and I then discuss the process of in the British case. They had fairly specific value established without naming the slaves, but making some assessment of the slaves' age, gender, and so forth. But in Puerto Rico, it was a uniform standard that was used in general, and it was the whole thing was processed by a joint board in Puerto Rico of government officials and representatives elected by the slaveholders. Where the Puerto Rico compensation money went is not clear, but the development of several sugar centrals in the island in the 1880s, 1990s, and especially a booming credit-rich coffee economy is suggested. The research has yet to be done, as far as I know, but the state of things in Britain should give pause. There, the identities of the slaveholders and the quantities paid are still unknown, much less the subsequent paths of their capital, and so far have proved immune to freedom of information actions. So I should be, that's pretty much it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you so much. Let's go on to the third presenter. She is Katarina Jacobson. She will be talking about the French Caribbean, Emancipation Day in the celebrations in the French Caribbean. She's a Guadeloupean archaeologist and collections manager at the Edgar Clark Archaeological Museum in Guadeloupe. She has a background in art history and archaeology, and she studied pre-Columbian archaeology at the University of Panthéon-Sorbonne in Paris, where she obtained a master's degree in 2002 in association with the Caribbean Research Center at Leiden University. For 5 years, she worked at the Edgar Clark Museum, implementing cultural activities. She later became the collections manager and carried out the required 10-year inventorization of the collections. In 2013, she joined the Nexus 1492 ERC research project at Leiden University in the Netherlands as a PhD candidate in Caribbean archaeology with a research focus on ceramic technology. In 2018, Katarina returned to Guadeloupe and the Edgar Clark Museum with the objective of setting up the conservation and preservation plan for the collections. She was also co-curator of the international exhibition Caribbean Ties, locally named Liens Caribbean. Well, I better leave it to
Liens Caribbean.
The native speakers, yes, the translation. In 2019, she received MAC's first Emerging Caribbean Museum Professional Award, one of the few first aiders to cultural heritage in time of crisis and natural disaster, UNESCO from the region. Katarina is the first archaeologist of Guadeloupean origin specializing in Caribbean archaeology. With you, Katarina.
Thank you, Raymond. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to talk about the French Caribbean. Let's put, I need to share my screen. Okay, wait for a bit. So let's go there. Okay. Okay. Yes. Then I'm going to talk about the French Overseas Department. That's main Guadeloupe and Martinique, with a main focus on Guadeloupe, which is the island where I come from and where I live. But for the one who don't speak French, but in order to have a broader audience, we decided to let the PowerPoint in French. Then you can listen to me or read the French PowerPoint. Guadeloupe and Martinique are still French department. That means that we have everything like in the department in the mainland, but we have in the Caribbean. And this is important to remember for the rest of the presentation. If we go to talk about the date of the slavery, after the French Revolution, France abolished the slavery in 1794. by the Convention Nationale. And it was after the Déclaration des Droits de l'Homme. But this first abolition was not stay for a short time, and Napoleon Bonaparte decided to reintroduce the slavery a few years after in 1802. And finally, after the different movement of the political situation in the French government, the Second Republic decided to definitively abolish the slavery on the initiative of Victor Schœlcher. And it was the 27th of April, 1842. Let's talk about Martinique. Then Martinique, at the abolition, the decree, what you have to remember is that the decree of the abolition was the 27th of April, but it was specified that the abolition was applied 2 months after for the sugarcane crops to be organized. But the enslaved people heard about this decree and they wanted it to apply. And after a rebellion of enslaved people in Martinique, the local governor decided that it was time for him to put this decree in application, and it was made the 22nd of May, 1848. And in Guadeloupe, the situation is a bit different. Why? Guadeloupe had 2 dates of abolition, yes. The first abolition I was talking about in 1794 was declared and was applied in Guadeloupe. Why in Guadeloupe and not Martinique? Because when they heard about in the beginning of 1894, Guadeloupe and Martinique became British colonies, and but they sent people, military to Guadeloupe, and the island became French, but Martinique stayed British, and because of this, the decree of the first abolition was not applied to Martinique. But a few years when Napoleon Bonaparte decided to re-establish the abolition, this was not, as you may think, a good thing for the enslaved new free people, and a lot of fight and rebellion started on the island. And the decree, the final decree of the 27th of April, 1848, was applied in Guadeloupe like in Martinique a few months after, but not the same date, the 27th of May, because it was the same, the local governor it was compulsory for him to apply it, because the enslaved people were aware of this decree and wanted to be free. And 87,000 enslaved people became free on the island, and Guadeloupe and Martinique stay under the French government. But with the initiative of different association, cultural and independentist association, they decide that not those 2 dates, the 27 in Guadeloupe and the 22 in Martinique, needed to be celebrated, and they become public holidays. But they wanted also that those dates were recognized and celebrated in the national history to federate all the French people. And we had to wait for the law of Taubira, the 10th May 2001, who recognized the trade and the slavery as crime against humanity. And since 2006, the French government in France decide to celebrate the memory of the trade, the slavery, and their abolition, the 10th of May, and the 23rd of May become the day to remember the victim of the colonial slavery. Then, if we summarize, we have in May, it's the month of the memory. You have two national dates, the 10th and the 23rd of May, but they are not public holidays. They are just dates where people commemorate. And you have public holidays in Guadeloupe and in Martinique, the 22nd of May and the 27th of May. I'm going to talk about more what's happening in Guadeloupe regarding to the Emancipation Day. All the association of cultural and independent association wanted that those dates were celebrated and that people remind and remember that this was part of our history, and they did a lot. They tried to invest a lot in the political sphere, and because of this, we start to have a lot of statues and monuments to show and to highlight those people, the enslaved people who fight for their freedom. You can see we have a boulevard we call the Boulevard des Héros, with Delgrès, with Mulatresse Solitude, which is a main story. It's a woman who fight. She was pregnant and she fight for the freedom. In all the city, you have statue and stele reminding and talking about the slavery. And the local council decide to make a road, the slave road, where all the heritage related to this time, colonial time, is those buildings are highlight to express and to show what was done during this time. In Guadeloupe, we have one of our big fort, a French military fort, which was renamed Fort Delgrès in memory of one of the fighters for the freedom of the enslaved people. And every year, that's the place where you have the commemoration for the Emancipation Day with a representative of the state and the local politician. If we go and look at the action made by the population, you will see that this day you have a lot of play of drums. Sometimes people go in the slave cemetery and they make some kind of procession to remember those enslaved people. We have one big cemetery in Le Moule, and that's a place where people do procession from the museum where are the skeleton storage to the cemetery. You have also artistic action where, like, as you may know, the French was directing the slavery via a book, the Code Noir, and some action with artistic, where they make a color code in opposition to this black Code Noir. You can see in the movie that people try to do things locally, like La Rue Cazenègre from its Martinican movie, 1802, which is a specific date I was saying when Napoleon re-established the slavery, and when the Guadeloupeans people start to fight for their freedom. They did movie of this, and you can find some other. That's what I put. You can find books talking about slavery. There is a lot of production to try to go to the public and to express and to explain what was going on. You have more historical article and books. You have comics. More and more you have novel, and to try to invest people in this story of their past. In archaeology also, we try to do our best with what we find in the cemetery, and show and give a voice to the enslaved people with the artifact we find. We like the movement I have with Local Voices. We try to highlight monuments and building, talking about this heritage, and try to reappropriate them for the public. And we have some private owners from African descendant who start to buy those buildings to kind of in a kind of resilient way, to switch the history in a way. In Guadeloupe, we have the big and the first center of interpretation and memory of the trade and slavery, which is a big kind of museum. It's a place where you can find information, education about this history. And it's the first place in the Caribbean talking about the slavery. But it's related, it's an interpretative center where you can find things related to art, contemporary art. At the national level, you will find some action like the Fondation pour la mémoire de l'esclavage, which is a foundation which want to support all the action related to history, all the projects related to history, pedagogy, memory, and fight against racism. And they try to help those projects to talk about this history, not only in Guadeloupe and Martinique and the other previous colony of France, but also in the mainland. Because as you can see, we are overseas, but we are part of the national France, and we need to be part of the national history. But not everything is well. I give you all the good parts, but we have also some kind of issue in Guadeloupe and Martinique, like the problem with the issue with Victor Schellcher. Victor Schellcher really did a lot for the slavery and the abolition of the slavery. And he gave, because of this, many places in Guadeloupe and Martinique and in France as his name, like the library in Martinique, the museum, Museum Schellcher. In Guadeloupe, you have one big city in Martinique and different streets. In Guadeloupe, we even have the 21st of July, which is a public holiday to celebrate the birthday of Victor Schellcher, but a lot of people think that it's not fair because it's only highlighting the white people who fight and did things for the abolition, but they are not talking about all the enslaved people who fight and who were part of the rebellion. And this what I was saying arrived to this, the unbolding of the statue, and those are in Martinique, where they decide that all the statue talking about only one side of the history shouldn't be there, or at least should be there with the other the enslaved rebellion participant. And you can see on the picture the statue of Joséphine de Beauharnais, which was the wife of Napoleon Bonaparte, and Pierre Bellet Desnambuc, which was the first French who colonized the island. And the last one is Victor Schellcher. And those three statues were unbolted in Martinique. And that was 2 years ago. In Guadeloupe, we also have a big employers run, which is supposed to celebrate the abolition of the Emancipation Day, but a lot of people think that should have been another day, because this day should be only to celebrate those enslaved who fight, and this time period, and not to do other activity. Finally, really, what do people think of this situation? We have different kind of thinking. For some people, this is really an important memory to do, and to think, to talk about this slavery story, and this should be told and expressed in all spheres of the local and the national history. For other people, it's for them, it's we are not anymore African, we are mixed, we have those French heritage, then this is behind us, don't talk about this, that's enough. And for another part of the population, it's the remind that, like our grandparents were saying, we don't talk about this time period. And those three way of thinking are really shaping the society of Guadeloupe and even in Martinique. And this is how we are actually. And this is really specific, because as we are still French, we want to be that our own history is tell and expressed in the national way, but we are still living in countries with the former colonialist, and with the same economic stratigraphy, because I didn't say, but the compensation after the end of the slavery was made, but French government compensate the previous owner of the slave, not the enslaved people, but the owner. And until today, the descendants of those owners are the ones who shape and have mostly all the economy of Guadeloupe and Martinique. Then we are almost still in the same kind of picture, and it's difficult to live in this country, in those two islands with this past, and to conceal this past. But we are working on it. Thank you. Gracias. Danke. Merci.
Thank you so much, Katarina. Thank you so much. And again, thank you, Rosemary, Juan, and Katarina, for your insights on Emancipation Day celebrations around the Caribbean, Dutch, Spanish, and French Caribbean. I just wanted to mention that anyone watching us through the Facebook Live can ask questions by placing them in the comments area of the Facebook Live transmission. Oh, perfect. But then I have, until we have any questions from the public, I have a general question for each one of them, and a more specific one that addresses the first one. Like, if we acknowledge that, well, we said at the beginning that emancipation is actually is not a day, it's actually an ongoing process, an ongoing social transformation process. Do Caribbean people feel that we have reached a proper level of transformation, of emancipation? That's the general question, to see what thoughts are provoked in each one of you. And then specifically for the Dutch Caribbean, Rosemary, there's a book called Smashing the Pillars. I haven't read it, but I have heard about it. I just wonder whether, and apparently it has something to do with the definition of Dutch identity. And I just wonder whether the book addresses that feeling of whether we have reached that proper level of transformation. In the case of Juan, in Puerto Rico, we have these cultural debates across time since the 30s, trying to define what Puerto Rican identity was. And back then we started saying, yes, it is the mix of the Puerto Rican identity or heritage is a mix of three heritages: African, Spanish, and indigenous. But always, well, certain groups would always say, yes, we are the mix, but the Spanish heritage is the one that really had an impact. Although you have some others that debate on the other side, like the Four-Storied Country book by that argues for giving a key a role to the Afro-Puerto Ricans. I just wonder what your impressions are from those debates, and also your own work capturing the history of Loíza. And actually, we reached you through Corredor Afro, which is an organization in Loíza that is making sure that Afro descendants is something that is acknowledged and treasured. And in the case of the French Caribbean, by the way, the Slavery Museum is impressive. I was there. It is really impressive. I just wonder whether the recent protests over COVID give you some hints on whether people actually feel that the social transformation has reached a proper level. So let's start with Rosemary.
Okay, thank you very much for these very enlightened questions. And I would like to place the process of emancipation within certain development that has taken place during history. And you will see that every time frame has their own discussion regarding to whether people have emancipated, or whether the abolition of enslavement, the abolition of slavery really brought about the emancipation of a large group of people. Because what's happening that in the 20th century, until 1948, you had a large group of people who could not vote. It is only in 1948 that you find that people could elect their people, their own people, in order for them to have representative in the government. That was the first time gender suffrage, whereby men and women could vote, was in 1949. And during the course of time, you see that people react, in particular in Curacao, where you had on the 30th of May, 1969, a kind of revolt against the existing situation, in the society, whereby race and class still coincided. And in that process, you see that people are discussing their situation, are protesting against their situation, and searching for more emancipation. So what I'm trying to indicate is that the process of emancipation has been an ongoing process. And at the moment, especially after 2010, when the political constitutional changes took place, and people are feeling, especially in the society, after the fact that in 1954, these islands became autonomous and could direct their own affair, you will see that people are feeling that there is a kind of recolonization taking place, and people are discussing about it. And just like Jacobson, Katarina said that in the French Caribbean, you have different approach towards that, the Dutch presence in the society. There are some people who are saying, okay, it is good. The politician who has been there has not done good work, so let the Dutch come in. Others are saying, no, we can do it ourselves. That real emancipation is learning from your problem and solving your problem. So that process is is the one we are present at the moment. And this discussion is going on some of the island more, on other islands much more, in order to look at, to redefine the emancipation process which has taken place from the 1863. So it is part of a process, it's still going on. Smashing the Pillar indeed show that the process which is taking place, but still we haven't arrived yet.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. Juan, do you have any impressions on this question? Your microphone.
Could you share this one of the slides, the third slide in my presentation? Do you have access to that, or Shawnee is? No te oigo.
I'm going to share it now.
It's the one with the statue, the first one with the monument, because that answers much of that one. Yeah. Well, what you're seeing is the main abolition monument in Puerto Rico. It's sad to say, in a way. If you show the next slide, right, it's in front of a 100-foot obelisk. That's the combination. And could you put the other one again? No, the preceding one. Right. As you can, and it's called El Redimido, the redeemed, to underline the situation. So that's kind of the image that this is from the 1950s, and this is from a time when the African legacy was beginning to be recognized and more accepted. And this is what Jose Luis Gonzalez critiqued in The Four-Storied Country, where he argued that Puerto Rico had a first story, a first level that was African, and then everything that came after that was more European or American and so forth, but that first level was always there. And that critique was very important. It was made in 1980. It was made in the face of this kind of perspective that's very condescending, simplistic, degrading. If this enslaved person was the redimido, I guess the redentor would be the white slaveholder who's not present in the image, but you could imagine the sculpture having both of them there, or perhaps the obelisk is the representation of the white slaveholder. So it's a very troubling sculpture that to this day is hailed as a great monument in Puerto Rico. I mean, this is we have a big problem in terms of our cultural images and identity that I think in Guadeloupe and Curacao, from what Rosemary and Katarina have demonstrated, ideas have gone pretty much more in advance in terms of the importance of slave resistance as embodied in monuments and commemorations and so forth. We have a ways to go on that. At the same time, Jose Luis Gonzalez's work was simplistic because you can't say that Puerto Rico's historical legacy was Black and just that. And there was like kind of a undiluted African legacy throughout. And I think that that's what I've been working on in my research in Loíza, to look at the complex way that creolization has come about in Puerto Rico, and how the importance of the free colored that Jose Luis Gonzalez barely mentions in his work. The importance of free colored is fundamental in Puerto Rico. It was the majority of the population, and we still have a lot to learn about it. There's been more work done on it in the last decade or so, but it's really taken a long time. So it makes for a more complex and much more interesting reading of history. In my work also, I have looked at, in terms of Piñones and in Loíza, and in terms of mental emancipation as opposed to formal emancipation, which is something I don't go into much. We have our episode in the 1790s also, as did Curacao and as did Guadeloupe, and it was in 1797. And it was a British invasion by Ralph Abercrombie, who also invaded St. Lucia, Grenada, and St. Vincent, and whose on two occasions, and whose invasions were responsible for the forced exile of the Saint Vicentians, the Garifunas, who were be called Garifunas, to the Central American coast. And Abercrombie would have done the same thing with Puerto Rico, possibly, and turned it into a sugar island if he had been successful. But the invasion was defeated in 1797 after 2 weeks. And it's a very important moment in Puerto Rican history that really helped to consolidate a popular identity, including the free-colored identity, because free-colored slaves and whites took part in the defense of the island. And so that there's a lot of work to be done in terms of interconnecting our histories, and particularly the 1790s, which was a fantastic, fascinating conjuncture in the history of the Caribbean. Everything was happening at the same time. Everybody was in arms, and slavery was facing a huge transformation at the time, all connected to the Saint-Domingue Revolution. So this monument is very well regarded. As I said, for example, a public intellectual, Jose Enrique Ayora Santaliz, who I'm sure that Javier knows about, and who's a very well-respected public intellectual, writes in a very enthusiastic way about the monument in an article from a couple of years ago, and he's fascinated by the fact that he had found, this is a 2021 article, and this is no fool. I mean, this guy is very well respected. He's a pro-independence, left-leaning public intellectual. He says, we haven't found in the entire American continent a more massive sculpture of African slavery, a monument of those dimensions, and very enthusiastic about it. So it's time we reappraise these things. I don't know if that's going to happen in the upcoming celebration next month.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you. Katarina.
Okay, first, Juan, like in all the Caribbean, don't forget the Amerindian, please. In the history, they are part of it. Please. Yes. Yes.
That was part of the problem with Jose Luis Gonzalez's work, and I was just focusing on that.
No problem. I will answer to your question, Raymond, related to the recent issue we had with the COVID. And for the one who don't know, we had a huge, massive strike in Guadeloupe and Martinique after the COVID reaction and how they applied the COVID system in Guadeloupe and Martinique. And since this, at the beginning, the strike was related to the COVID obligation, the vaccine obligation, but in a quick way, the strike became a social one, and highlighting a lot of problems we have in Guadeloupe and Martinique. And the final result of this is that for many people, this situation of the COVID was highlighting that we are more than colonies. That's how people feel. We are talking about emancipation, and the COVID in 2020 and until now show us that we were France was reacting to the island, to the territories, the overseas territories, in a different way. And sometimes in the national discourse, we were part of the national France, and in other parts we were like different territories. And for a lot of people, we really feel like, yeah, we were not part of it, and it's almost like we became long time in back to all the process we made to go to this intercultural living and living together was almost broken with this, and we will have a lot of things to do after those strikes. And I'm really big open-minded person, but it's hard after this to try to convince a part of the population that we are not seen as colonies, and it's difficult.
Thank you, Katarina. We have a couple of questions from the audience, the Facebook Live audience. One of them is coming from Juan de Hippolyte. This question is for everyone. Why do you think that there is more focus on the Anglophone Caribbean in the discourse related to all this emancipation?
Because, like, for us, we don't talk about emancipation, we say abolition. Then when I first read emancipation, it's a question of language. I'm not familiar, and it's not affiliated for me to talk about emancipation. We talk about slavery, the end, the abolition day. We don't say this, and this may be a question of language, I think. And why? It's because there is more English. English is the main language, and they are the one who have more voice, I think. The French are always the last one.
Yeah.
Thank you.
In the case of Puerto Rico, if I may, the distinction is clearer because abolition is used for slavery, the abolition of slavery, and emancipation is a synonym, and we know it's a synonym, but it's not used a whole lot. In English, abolition is a synonym of emancipation as well, but in historical discussion, it's usually the abolition of the slave trade. And it's abolition of the slave trade and emancipation when the emancipation of, in terms of the ending of slavery. That's the tendency in English. This is nothing mechanic about this, it's a tendency, but it has also shaped historiographical debates. And in case of the Spanish Caribbean, it's very interesting because we didn't have an abolition of the slave trade as such. So the word abolition kind of is simply used for the abolition of slavery. And there's no need, in a sense, to use it for abolition of the slave trade because the slave trade was never abolished. There was always a slave trade going on. There were treaties between England and Spain that were supposedly forbidding the slave trade and halting it. But Spain, under the pressure of the Cuban planters, really kept on, the slave trade kept on going until the 1860s. So it has a very secondary or almost inexistent position in the Spanish historiographical literature. The abolition of the slave trade hardly exists, whereas in the English tradition, the abolition of the slave trade is hugely important in 1907. And it marked, for example, it's the basis of capitalism and slavery, Eric Williams, and all the discussion about Wilberforce and the role of Christian thought and so forth has to do with the abolition of the slave trade, which was a very different debate from the emancipation, because many who favored the abolition of slave trade were against emancipation. So it's a complex situation that the Spanish Caribbean really doesn't address because of our particular history, but it's important to look at the differences in the words.
Thank you, Juan.
And I think for the Dutch Caribbean, I think the language also plays a very important role because most of the publications are sometimes written in Dutch or in Papiamento, in particular for the Dutch Leeward Island. And for the Dutch Wonder Island, you see that some publications are being presented in English. So I think the language plays a role, and also the attitude to look more towards Amsterdam than to the rest of the Caribbean, which is something which has been talking about, that we prefer to look to London or to Amsterdam or perhaps to Madrid or Paris, instead of looking within ourselves and discussing and going into conversation with ourselves. So I think this this moment and this happening is a very worthwhile one, because it's allow us to learn from each other and to discuss more about what is our problem and what are the things bothering us, or how we have celebrated certain events. So I think it's very important that it's happening. Yeah.
Right. I'd also like to mention that the slave trade is a huge historical phenomenon that needs to be discussed by itself. And it's not good to collapse it into plantation slavery, which is also a huge historical phenomenon. And if we just talk about abolition, kind of covering the two, no. And that's not the way it operated in English history in particular, in British, the history of slavery, because 1807 and the debate around the slave trade was very important, politically decisive, and very separate from and also, as it happens, more attention has gone to the abolition of the slave trade in Anglo-American historiography. More attention has gone to abolition of the slave trade than to emancipation of slavery in the 1830s, for some reason, which is not good either, because then kind of the balance goes in the other direction against emancipation, which is tremendously interesting and complex in the 1830s as well. So that's the importance of kind of making the distinction between words that is not often made.
Thank you, Juan. There's another question from the Facebook Live audience, specifically from Lisa Williams. Is there much interest in the Dutch Caribbean about the significant amount of Scottish enslavers who were compensated on emancipation in the Dutch Caribbean colonies?
At the moment, let's say if we are looking at Suriname, Suriname is part of, it is within the discussion of CARICOM, and they are discussing the process of reparation. At the moment on the Dutch Caribbean island, this process is coming up. People are, by certain groups, whereby people are discussing in which way the island should be compensated. For example, a few months ago, there was a discussion organized by UNESCO and by the government related to the act of compensation. And it was done in a debate in the sense of people who are pro reparation and people who are against reparation. They say, okay, it doesn't, it doesn't make any sense. So there is this discussion. It is a bit paradoxal in the sense that you have the different voices which are discussing the issue of whether to recompensate or not, or even giving an excuse for slavery. Like I said in my presentation, at the moment you're seeing in the Netherlands, there is a lot of debate going about, and there is a kind of real awakening regarding the slave trade and the slave period in the Netherlands, in the Dutch Caribbean, and mostly also set forward by the Surinamese or also the other people who are living in the Netherlands, like the one from Curacao and the other islands of the Caribbean. They have become like a very critical masses in order to shake up the Netherlands and the Dutch people for them to become more aware of that history. So this discussion is going on. This discussion is very much alive at the moment. And at the other side, it also shaking up the situation in particular the Dutch Caribbean islands and most the Leeward Islands. Yes.
Thank you, Rosemary. Juan or Katarina, are you aware of any reparations, debates around reparations, slavery reparations?
Yes, there is some association who asked the French government for reparation, and the last answer was, I think, 2 months ago, and the French government said that they were not going to open this discussion. But that's what people are asking. It's not fair and it's not possible that we still live in this country with one part of the population who had reparation, like the owner, the former owner, and not the descendant of the slave people. And this is a big deal in the island, because it was in Guadeloupe and Martinique, and because French government say no, they decide that it's time to go to the international court. And they want to put this topic to the international court because French doesn't want to talk about this.
Thank you, Katarina. Juan, any comments?
In Puerto Rico, no. In fact, there's an, at least in the official levels and in the kind of the mainstream historiography, no interest. And there's an interview with Professor González Valle that a couple of years ago where he was asked about reparation. I said no, that there's has no importance in the case of Puerto Rico, and I think for good reasons. That is believed by many because on the one hand, the issue of reparation is not well known, and the extent of it, even though Luis Diaz Soler in his history of slavery devotes a couple of chapters to it in a very detailed way, but since reparations are not taken into account, the compensation, the history of compensation is not taken into account, then that becomes less. And then if the idea that abolition was a happy process, as many believe, and was a occasion for festivities, and where the former enslaved kept on working with the slaveholders and so forth, then there's really no need to talk about reparations. So it fits in with the whole discourse, is what I'm saying.
Right.
To not be interested in reparations.
Yeah, and in many cases, people think of reparation with a financial point of view. And
Which
it's
is
not only this. Yeah.
Doesn't have to be at all. I mean, just opening the archives would be, a big step.
Yes.
And facilitating research would be a very big step in reparation. And giving money to students to do research.
Yeah. And also improving the educational system in most of this society. I think.
Doesn't have to do with outlays. Doesn't have to do with outlays of money and that kind of thing.
Right. In that line of money for research, recently a project called Islanders at the Helm was approved in the Netherlands for the University of St. Martin. So they were happy that for the first time they will have PhD students based in the University of St. Martin doing research that is relevant to the Dutch Caribbean. So that's interesting. On the other hand, there are some other debates. But another question for Professor Allen from Kai Boyd. How do you see Papiamento in the emancipation process? You write in Papiamento yourself, and do you see Papiamento as an obstacle to relationship with the greater Caribbean? What can be done to allow Papiamento to fulfill a greater role for the discourse?
I don't see Papiamento as an obstacle for the greater Caribbean, in the sense that I think in the greater Caribbean, the society respect Curacao and the Papiamento speaking society for the fact that we have done so much in dealing with the Papiamento, in the sense with coming with a manner of writing, a standard manner of writing, books being published in Papiamento. So I think Papiamento is for the in particular the Dutch Leeward Island a very important form of emancipation, in the sense that, and we are very proud of the language. That's something which is not doubt about. The discussion of Papiamento should go to school as a language of instruction has been taken a very long time, and it shows a bit a form of being a bit doubtful whether, so it's a bit contradictory as well. But in general, I see that there is much respect for the language. a few days ago, it was celebrated even with all kind of discussion around the use of papiamento and the importance of papiamento. So there is, but at the other side, there is this paradox which I've been trying to show, that one side there is a respect, but the other side there is also the discussion whether papiamento should go to school, become language of instruction, and whether the papiamento will increase people's ability to communicate with the wider world. So that discussion is also there. And personally, I feel that you have to know your language, your mother language very well, because that also helps you to understand and to learn other language better. If you know how to speak your own language in a very good manner, it also help you in order to be able to captive and to learn other languages much better.
Thank you so much, Rosemary. We have reached the ending time. There are a couple of other questions that we might direct to the presenters so that they can answer directly if they haven't already with what we have been discussing. And once again, thanking each one of you for being part of this, thanking Shawnee and the UE Museum, Samantha, for inviting us to have this space for exchange around this very relevant topic. So Shawnee.
May I say something?
Sure,
Next
go ahead.
Next time, I think it will be better to have half an hour for the speakers. Okay. So.
Well, yes, that's true. We actually, I think one of the issues with being virtual is that you actually have to manage the time, because in a lot of ways we've been virtual for the last 2 years, and more persons are becoming virtual, tired, zoomed out, as the term is. But I want to kind of do a final vote of thanks, because I really want to really just say thank you to my co-collaborators, which include the Caribbean Heritage Network, Society for Caribbean Studies, Center for the Advanced Studies, Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, and Local Voices. What I want people to know is that the ability to be able, from the English-speaking Caribbean perspective, to be able to offer a panel that covers a wide range of regional information, as well as the kind of nuanced ways in which the presenters talk about the topic. You actually have to be living in a networked regionalist position. And I really want to thank Raymond, Katarina and I work multiple other zones together, and we're completely committed to a kind of cross-silo, and Raymond too, because we sit on other boards together, cross-silo conversation. And as a person trained in Caribbean, in the English-speaking Caribbean history, I recognize the limitations of our individual conversations, especially the debate around abolition versus emancipation. The date is so clear in the English-speaking Caribbean, and if you're not careful, you think of the post-1807 trade as an illegal trade, but the only person who's made it illegal is Britain. Everybody else is going about their business. And really that then shifts your perspective. But also having the regional conversation about emancipation opens new doors for us to think about how we even begin the process of commemorating and representing the past and the different ways in which different countries in the region continue, to speak about it, but also what it means when you're still an overseas dependency or department, or even a part of a kingdom, which is across the Atlantic, and what it means for a continued notion of an emancipated space, a space of freedom and abolition. So I want to really thank all of my colleagues, and I do believe that what we really need is an opening of the archive, not only in our own countries, but also better training, especially in the English-speaking Caribbean, scholars like myself to be able to use other archives, because then it transforms the ways in which we would think about our own research and the kinds of questions that we need to ask about language and interpretation. So I really just want to thank all of you for spending time today to have this conversation, and I really appreciate it. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us. This panel will be available on the UN Museum YouTube page, along with panels 1, 2, and 3. And if you're a school teacher, this data will definitely help you with how you express the information to your students. And if you're just interested in reparations, emancipation is a very important part of that discussion. So thank you all for joining us.
Tadiki manera no lo vivane munagi.